Okay. So how are you guys doing? Did you have a chance to see any or watch the inauguration yesterday, or see any highlights on the TV or anything?
Well, actually, I saw I saw the inauguration online. I was caught up in studying, so I didn't get a chance to see the full thing. I did see the president's speech.
Hmm. Hmm.
I knew President Trump wasn't going to be at the inauguration.
Right, right. And normally, it's interesting. I watched it. Oluwakemi, did you get a chance to see any of it?
Yes, I watch most of it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I watched it pretty much from start to finish. I didn't watch like the parade part, but I watched everything at the Capitol building, and a couple of speeches. The poem from the young poet was amazing. I thought it was awesome. Um, and that was pretty much like every modern, well, for quite a long time, what every inauguration looks like. It's in front of it's on that side of the Capitol building. They build a stage. Everybody's there. The Supreme Court's there. The all three branches of government, really. The legislative branch of a large, most of the House of Representatives and the Senate. The executive branch. You have the previous president and vice president. Normally, this time President Trump chose not to go, but Vice President Mike Pence was there. And you have the judicial branch. I believe the whole uh, Supreme Court was there. So the three branches of government come together, and this transfer of power from one person to the next, or from one party to the next, is the foundational assumption of American government. If we don't have that, then we don't have uh, America.
You're
Which I
right.
think is the threat of the uh, the attack on the Capitol building 2 weeks ago. We didn't have a peaceful transition of power. For the first time in our nation's history, we did not have a peaceful transfer of power, um, which is remarkable. But yesterday went smoothly. It was really good. I thought, again, my big takeaway was that poem. Um,
I saw a little bit of the poem. How did you like it?
I thought, I mean, certainly the young lady delivered it really well. She wrote it and delivered it really well. But there were so many lines that, are could be takeaways. I watched it yesterday, and then last night I watched it with my kids, and I really liked it. I really liked it. I'd like to like read it and kind of digest it a little more slowly. Um, Now it's not going to change the world, but for it's a piece of art, and art can be an inspiration to us, and certainly marks that moment in history. You know, Yesterday. Um, I thought it was pretty cool. And thank goodness everything went smoothly. There was no problems, no big problems. So that was that's a good thing. A little bit of boringness can be good. We don't need all that excitement all the time. Um, so good. I'm glad you guys got to watch it again. Um, so what I thought we'd do is turn the clock way back, um, and see. We're going to take 2 or 3 weeks, certainly two, and look at what led up to the American Revolution. Okay, 1776. Of course, we have um, the Declaration of Independence, right, where the British colonies in America, the American colonies, declared their independence from England, from Britain. Well, something led up to that. That's a pretty big deal. And of course, Britain said no. So then they fought a war over it. They fought the American Revolution, or the Revolutionary War, in the 1770s into the 1780s. That's a big deal, big enough to fight a war. So what led them to that point where they said, okay, we can't do this anymore. We don't want to be British. We want to be our own country. We want to invent a country. And then they knew that would be a lot of hard work. So obviously you don't make that choice lightly. So what got them to that point? We're going to look at a couple of things this week and next. Maybe it'll take us 3 weeks. We'll see. And really zoom in on that moment. Okay. Now, I think it's good to know. It's good for us to know as Americans, as citizens, or being in America. It's also good to know for the GED social studies test or high set test. So think back, put it into perspective. Let me look. Let me pull up my timeline. Okay, so our timeline here, we have 1600 when the Mayflower, the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower in 1620. Jamestown, Virginia was founded in 1607. So that early 1600s is the beginning of the British colonies. The Pilgrims are 1620. Okay. Through the 1600s, through most of the 1700s, people living here were just British people. They were British citizens, ruled by the Parliament, the government in England, in London. But after 100 years, after 150 years, the people living here say, we have a very long history of being here. And quite frankly, we don't feel British anymore, right? They kind of had lost their British accent. Like they spoke differently, they dressed differently, they acted differently. They were, after 150 years of being on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, they felt different. They felt different than the people in London, the people ruling them from London, England. So, look at the timeline. This is, to put it into perspective, a very long period of being a colony. And then we have the American Revolution. We're talking the 1770s. Well, today we're going to talk about it, 1760s, 1770s. Okay. And then, of course, there's a lot that happens after that. So we're going to read, let's preview here, see if any of these things ring a bell. Okay, we're going to talk about the Stamp Act. Have you ever heard of the Stamp Act?
No.
No? Okay.
No. Okay.
Now, an act is like a law, right? So when we talk
Yeah.
about a Stamp Act, we don't really use that term anymore. I don't know if they use it in Britain, but it's just when Parliament, their government, it's different than ours, is called, in their Parliament, when they pass a law, I don't know, it's called an act. At least back then it was. So the Stamp Act in 1765. That's what it looks like. Okay, we'll talk about these things. Then you have the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Acts. They're not so famous, okay, but we'll talk about them. They're a big enough deal that I put them in here. I built this reading this week. There's a lot of other things that happen, but I've tried to pull out the big ones. So these aren't so famous, but they're a big deal. Okay, they're important. So the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Acts. Then we have the Boston Massacre, 1770. Okay, so we're getting closer to 1776. Boston Massacre, we've probably heard about that before. And then, and there's a famous picture of it, drawing. And then the Boston Tea Party. Okay, 1773, still leading up to 1776. Okay, and then the Intolerable Acts. They call the colonists called these 4 acts, and we'll look at them. These 4 acts they called the Intolerable Acts because they couldn't tolerate them. They were intolerable. They were unbearable. Okay, and then that leads us at the end. We'll do a quick little talk about what was coming, which was the famous painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so have you guys heard of the Boston Tea Party before the Boston Massacre?
No, I never heard anything about that before.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
Because those are pretty big deals. So I mean, if you haven't, that's I understand. If that if that news hadn't trickled over um, into Nigeria, that's okay. But those are two big things. Okay, they were well, the Boston Tea Party, we'll talk about probably next week, is a protest. They were protesting a tax on tea by dumping a bunch of tea, British tea, into Boston Harbor off a boat, just like in this painting. Okay. They were protesting and they did a bunch of what happens is you have a struggle for power between the British who were ruling the colonists and the American colonists who wanted to rule themselves. And it's a push, they keep pushing against each other in many different ways. Um, Up until the moment that they declared independence. Okay, so let's look at this story for the next 2, maybe 3 weeks. We'll see how far we get today. We'll see how far we get to next week. Okay, so the Stamp Act controversy. I've gone through, how many paragraphs do we have till the end? 30 paragraphs. We'll see. We'll see how we do. Okay. We'll start with, I broke them into chunks. Actually, I took this from, here's the links from everything I copied, and I changed a few things, but it's from ushistory.org, which is kind of an online textbook, pretty readable, goes through things at a good pace, but it's just an online textbook. So like each of these red sections is a page, and it's like turning the page in an actual textbook. This is kind of like a high school textbook. Okay, ushistory.org is where I got it. Okay, so the Stamp Act controversy, 1765. I'm not big on memorizing years, but it does help you understand when you know the years as they happen, right? So if we keep in 1776 in our mind, always think of that as like the threshold where they they drew a line and said, we are now an independent nation and we are going to fight a war to make it so. 1776, this is 11 years before that. Okay. It's not important that it happens in 1765. It's not important that you remember it, but it's good to know when it happened because this is 11 years before the Declaration of Independence. There's a big difference if it was 1 year or a month before, right? So 11 years. So we can keep in mind, just kind of keep things in mind. Okay. So let me jump in and then we can take turns reading. So the Stamp Act controversy, 1765. Something was dreadfully wrong in the American colonies. All of a sudden, after over a century and a half of permitting relative self-rule, Britain was exercising direct influence over colonial life. In addition to restricting westward movement, the parent country was actually enforcing its trade laws. Okay, so we see we are jumping in kind of in the middle of a story here, right? This is in ushistory.org. This is chapter 9. So they've already told us the whole in that online textbook. They already told the story of the colonies and a bunch of stuff. So we're kind of jumping in the middle. But it says all of a sudden, after over a century and a half of permitting relative self-rule, Britain was exercising direct influence over colonial life. So they're kind of tightening things up because the British or the colonists were already rebelling a little bit, already protesting a little bit, not a lot, but enough that the British Parliament, British rulers were like, you know what, we better tighten up our control here on these colonists. We better make sure they know who's in charge. We better tighten things up. Olabakimi, could you read paragraph 2? Is that big enough? Can you guys see it okay on the screen? Is the text big enough?
Sorry, yes, it's okay with me.
Okay.
I
Yeah,
did
go.
unmute. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay.
Writs of assistance. Writs of assistance or general search warrants were granted to British customs inspectors to search colonial ships. The inspectors had long the inspectors had long been charged with this directly, but until this time had not carried it out. Violators did not receive the benefit of a trial by jury. Rather, they were at the mercy of the British Admiralty courts. Worst of all, the British now began levying taxes against American colonies. What had gone wrong?
Okay, so like I said, the British were tightening control of the colonies, um, and it started with taxes. Okay, and enforcing, it says enforcing its trade laws. Okay. Um, British customs inspectors could search colonial ships. They didn't do it much, but now they started to do it a little bit more. Violators, if you broke those trade laws, um, didn't get a trial by jury. They were at the mercy of the British Admiralty courts, which is like the military courts. So you're not just in a court with a judge and you get to have a lawyer. It was a pretty crappy system, and it wasn't very fair. Okay. And they started levying taxes on the American colonists. Jendai, could you read paragraph 3? Jendaya, you there? Can you read paragraph 3 for us? Oh, maybe he stepped away. Okay. Um, I'll read paragraph 3 for now. The British point of view is not difficult to grasp. The 7 Years' War had been terribly costly. Now, the 7 Years' War is what we call in America, we call the French and Indian War. It was a war in the 1750s. Okay, so a little bit before this time period. In the 1750s, the British and the British colonists, too, the American colonists, fought against the French and the Indians. It was the British and colonists on one side, and the French and the Indians. Of course, there's Native American Indians living here on the other. But it was really between Britain and France fighting for control of North America. Well, Britain won. And in Britain, they called it the 7 Years' War because it lasted about 7 years. Here we call it the French and Indian War. Okay, but it says the 7 Years' War had been terribly costly. The taxes asked of the American colonists were lower than those asked of mainland English citizens. The revenue raised from taxing the colonies was used to pay for their own defense. Moreover, the funds received from American colonists barely covered 1/3 of the cost of maintaining British troops in the 13 colonies. So every historian knows, and every student of history of the American Revolution knows, they started to tax the colonists, the American colonists, to pay for the war they fought. They spent a lot of money fighting the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, it says here. Okay, so they were in debt. Britain was in debt because they paid a lot of money to cost money to fight a war. They need to pay that off, so they start taxing the citizens, the colonial citizens. Okay, and the British would say, hey, your taxes in America are lower than those of English people, mainland English people. The taxes that they were charging the American colonists only covered 1/3 of the costs of maintaining British troops in the 13 colonies. So the British would say, hey, we're not taxing you all that much. It's not that big of a deal. Paragraph 4, the Americans, however, saw things through a different lens. What was the purpose of maintaining British military forces in the colonies now that the French threat was gone? Americans wondered about contributing to the maintenance of troops they felt were there only to watch them. Okay, so the Americans, and now I'm going to say Americans. Now they weren't Americans; they were, British colonists in America. But the Americans said, "Hey, we don't need British troops living here. We are British citizens, and so what's the big deal?" All right, hold on. Let me let me mute myself here. Oh, excuse me. Okay. All right, Jendai, could you read paragraph? Why don't you read 5 and 6 for us?
Sure. Here we go. True, those in England paid more in taxes, but Americans paid much more in sweat. All the land that was cleared, the Indians who were fought, and the relatives who died building a colony that enhanced the British Empire made further taxation seem insulting. In addition to the emotional appeals, the colonists began to make a political argument as well. The tradition of receiving permission for levying taxes dated back hundreds of years in British history. But the colonists had no representation in the British Parliament to tax them without offering representation was to deny their traditional rights as English subjects. This could not stand.
Okay, thank you. So the thing that they always said, now it's not very catchy, this isn't a slogan that we would like today, but they said no taxation without representation. Okay, no taxation without representation. You can't tax us in America unless we have some representatives in Parliament. But there was no representative for the colonists, for the colonies in Parliament in London, which makes sense. I mean, makes sense that doesn't feel fair, right? Um, so their argument is we are British citizens. Why? And they were British citizens for 150 years. Why do we not have a representative in our government, in the legislative government, Parliament? You're taxing us. How come we don't get a say in the government by having representation there? So that was their argument. Their feeling from very early on, 1750s, 17. Well, now we're going to see the Stamp Act of 1765. Okay, it says the Stamp Act of 1765 was not the first attempt to tax the American colonies. Parliament had passed the Sugar Act and Currency Act the previous year. Because tax was collected at ports, though, it was easily circumvented. Indirect taxes such as these were also much less visible to the consumer. Okay, so the Stamp Act isn't the first time that the colonists were taxed, but it's the first time that regular people, you and me, would feel the tax. Okay, because if they had the Sugar Act, and that was, I think, early in the 1860s or 1760s. Not much before. But the Sugar Act taxed sugar. Now, uh, these people weren't baking chocolate chip cookies, but what did they use all their sugar for at the time? They're not eating candy bars. They're not making candy bars with it. What did they use sugar? What did British colonists, British people, consume a lot of that they did with sugar?
They drink their tea.
Yeah, the tea. Okay, so I mean, it was a very British thing to do in the world to drink tea. They drank a lot of tea. Okay, for one thing, water wasn't as clean, right? They didn't they didn't generally have indoor plumbing, and even if they did, the water you're drinking is not very clean. So people drank a lot of tea. They didn't drink a lot of water, right? They didn't have bottled water or anything. There weren't a whole lot of drinks available. I mean, there was tea, coffee, and alcohol, wine and beer. And they drank a lot of all those things. But British people, including the American colonists, drank a lot of tea. Well, they liked sugar with their tea. So the British Parliament taxed their sugar. But it says here, Because tax was collected at ports, though, it was easily circumvented. To circumvent means to get around. So the sugar was taxed, but it was taxed at the port where it was brought in to be sold, right? So if I'm a tea drinker and I go and I buy a pound of sugar, I don't I'm not myself paying the sugar tax. The person who's selling me the sugar has already paid the tax. You know what I mean? So I don't feel that tax. The previous ones, the Sugar Act, the Currency Act. Now I don't know exactly what the Currency Act was. Currency is money, so maybe it was some, maybe it was some financial tax or something. Okay, but the Sugar Act was real and it hurt the colonists. But since they weren't paying it themselves out of their pockets, they didn't really feel that it was unfair. The Stamp Act was different. Okay, so it says, when Parliament passed the Stamp Act in March 1765, things changed. It was the first direct tax on the American colonies. Every legal document had to be written on specially stamped paper showing proof of payment. Deeds, wills, marriage licenses, contracts of any sort were not recognized as legal in a court of law unless they were prepared on this paper, the paper with the stamp. In addition, newspaper, dice, playing cards also had to bear proof of tax payment. American activists sprang into action. So there wasn't anything special about the paper, right? Except if it was a legal document, a will, a deed, a contract, a marriage license, the British government wouldn't recognize that marriage license unless you paid a few extra pennies to put it on the stamped paper. And these are a couple of stamps. It's nothing special, just has a stamp on it. That's all. But it shows that you paid a couple extra pennies and paid the tax and got that special paper, which is kind of insulting, right? That's just, it doesn't feel fair if you're an American colonist. So I could see why they took offense at it, why it was so upsetting, right? There's no difference between if I hire you, to do a job for me and we sign a contract, there's no difference if we sign it on a regular piece of paper or a stamped piece of paper, but I have to legally have you sign a stamped piece of paper, which costs a little bit extra. Okay. It just feels unfair, and maybe it was unfair because they weren't represented in Parliament, and, starts to feel unfair. So that's the Stamp Act. Okay. Does that make sense? Are we explaining that well? Like what the stamp was? You guys understand that?
Yes.
Okay. It's just a silly little stamp that, you had to buy that special paper. And it costs a few extra pennies. Okay. Oluwakimi, could you read paragraph 9? Oluwakimi, maybe you're still muted.
Sorry.
That's
Is
okay.
it from taxation or when Parliament?
Paragraph 9, taxation.
Okay. Taxation in this manner and the Cotton Acts, which require the American colonies to provide food and shelter for British troops, were soundly trashed in colonial assemblies, from Patrick Henry in Virginia to James Otis in Massachusetts. Sorry.
That's okay.
Americans voiced their protest. A Stamp Act Congress was convened in the colonies to decide what to do.
I want you to go ahead and finish that section, paragraphs 10 and 11 there.
The colonies put their words into action and enacted widespread boycott of British goods. Radical groups such as the Sons and Daughters of Liberty did not hesitate did not hesitate to harass tax collectors or publish the names of those who did not comply with the boycotts. Soon, the pressure on Parliament by business-starved British merchants was too great to bear. The Stamp Act was repealed the following year. The crisis was over, but the uneasy peace did not last long.
Okay, so first I want to highlight it says the Quartering Act, which required American colonies to provide food and shelter for British troops. Now, if you think back, if you were in the class, once or twice when we've discussed the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments.
Yeah.
I think it's the Third Amendment or the Fourth Amendment, yeah, third or the fourth, says that Americans can't be required to quarter troops. And at the time when we discuss it, I always say, this isn't something we care about. It's not part of our lives today. But they wrote it then into the Bill of Rights, into the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It was a big deal to them because under British rule, they were required by the Quartering Act that American colonies, if a British soldier or 10 British soldiers knocked on your door and wanted, then you have to provide them food and shelter. Okay, which definitely feels unfair, I should think. Okay, so this is not a big deal to us today, but it was a big deal to them. And so, down the road from here, where they're writing the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, they put a block on that. They stopped that from happening again. Okay, so that's the Quartering Act. Not a big deal to us today, but definitely a big deal to them back then. And it says a Stamp Act Congress was convened in the colonies to decide what to do, which means, the colonies, the 13 colonies sent representatives together. I don't know where this was held or when, but they decided to boycott. What does it mean to boycott something?
Not to attend.
To not attend if it's an event, or we're talking the Stamp Act. So if they were to boycott this, what would that mean to boycott the Stamp Act?
Not to use it.
Yeah, you're required to get this special paper, and they say, no, we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna buy that special paper. We're not gonna buy the stamps. Okay, so across the 13 colonies, now not everybody, but there was a lot of people who boycotted and said, no, we're not going to do that. And it says radical groups such as the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty, it says they did not hesitate to harass tax collectors, publish the names of those who did not comply with the boycotts. The Sons of Liberty, you could look into them in history. They were almost if they did those things today, we would call them terrorist groups. They would take British tax collectors, and the Sons of Liberty was a group. They would take British tax collectors and harass them. They would beat them up. I don't know if they would kill British tax collectors, although they would beat them. They would tar and feather them. They would attack them. They were kind of terrorists, really. If they did it today, we'd call them terrorists. Is that good? Is it fair? I don't know. Is it good? I don't know. But it's part of American history. They harassed, and when it says they harassed tax collectors, it means they beat them. They beat them in the streets. Okay. I don't know. The good, bad is, I don't know, but it's part of the story. And so soon the pressure on the Parliament by business-starved British merchants. If nobody's going to buy anything with a stamp on it, if I'm a merchant, if I'm a seller of something, I'm going to put pressure on Parliament to say, hey, this Stamp Act is killing my business. You got to change it. So the Stamp Act was repealed the following year. It didn't last very long, 1765, 1766, they repealed it. But, something's going on. The crisis was over, but the uneasy peace did not last long. There is a tension pushing back and forth between the colonists who wanted to rule themselves and the British who did not want to give up ruling the American colonies, right? We all are either parents or we have parents, and sometimes when the kid pushes back against the parents' authority, sometimes parents, push back harder, you yell a little louder, or you get angry at the kid just for questioning the authority of the adult, right? Again, not saying it's good or bad, but when somebody questions you, sometimes you can push back a little harder because it's not good that they're questioning your authority. Parents, governments, whatever. Okay, so now we have the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Acts. These are not famous. Okay, you've probably heard of the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act. Next week we'll talk about the Boston Massacre. But let's cover this: the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Acts. Not famous, but I think these are important steps toward what's coming. Right? We're going to get to a point where the American colonies say we can't take it anymore. This is not fair. We're breaking away. We're declaring our independence. This is a step that's definitely pushing them towards that. Okay, Jendai, could you read paragraph 12? Jendai, could you read paragraph 12 for us? That's okay. I'll read paragraph 12. It says the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Acts, 1766. Nervous tension is the term that best describes the relationship between the American colonies and England in the aftermath of the Stamp Act repeal. To repeal means to undo a law, right? So they repealed the Stamp Act. Several issues remained unresolved. First, Parliament had absolutely no wish to send a message across the Atlantic that ultimate authority lay in the colonial legislatures. Okay, that's kind of a tricky sentence. Let's read it again. First, Parliament had absolutely no wish to send a message across the Atlantic that ultimate authority lay in the colonial legislatures. Each colony, future states, each colony did have its own little kind of state government, colony government.
I'm so sorry. You asked me to read this.
That's okay.
I didn't know I was muted.
Oh, okay. Well, you can read the next one. But let me.
The
So then,
act.
well, hold on. Let me finish here. So then it says, immediately after repealing the Stamp Act, Parliament declared the Declaratory Act. Okay, so go ahead. Paragraph 13. What is the Declaratory Act?
The act proclaimed Parliament's ability to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear. Under no circumstances did Parliament abandon in principle its right to legislate for the 13 colonies.
Okay, so they're saying, just in case you're wondering, colonies, England still rules you, right?
Right.
Now, the colonies, they can set their own laws about little things, right? But it says ultimate authority lies with Parliament. They're just saying, hey, just in case you think you're getting power here, you're not. Power still rests in London. Okay. All right, Jendai, go ahead and read paragraph 14 as well.
Okay. In the Western Hemisphere, leaders were optimistic about the repeal of the Stamp Act, but found the suggestions on the Declaratory Act threatening. Most American statement had drawn a clear line between the legislation and taxation. I'm sorry. In 1766, the notion of par, parliamentary sup, supremacy over the law was questioned only by the radical few, but the ability to tax without representation was another matter. The Declaratory Act made no such distinction. All cases whatsoever could surely mean the power to tax. Many assemblymen waited anxiously for the issue to resurface.
Okay.
Sure enough,
Yeah.
truce did not last long. Back in London, Charles Townshend persuaded the House of Commons once again tax the Americans. Now, this time through an import tax on such items as glass, paper, lead, and tea.
Okay. So thank you. So the Declaratory Act declares that, the colonies are not independent. They do not rule themselves. London Parliament still rules them. And, and that was definitely upsetting to the colonists. They found the suggestions of the Declaratory Act threatening. They could still be taxed. They were not ruling themselves. They were not represented in Parliament. And then Townsend, this isn't really, we just have one sentence here, but somebody, one of the parliament members, Charles Townsend, persuaded the House of Commons once again to tax the Americans, this time through an import tax on such items as glass, paper, lead, and tea. So this is just a bunch more taxes, which was, the first, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, those were to pay for the French and Indian War, which had been fought in the colonies by the colonists in the 1750s. Okay, so the first taxes were to pay for the war. Okay, you may not like it, but it makes sense, right? The Townshend Acts were just punishment. They were punishing and just putting the colonists back in their place, taxing big things: glass, paper, lead, tea. Okay, these are a big deal. So we're seeing. Let's stop there, but next week we can pick up. We're seeing a march, a series of events that lead that increasingly anger and increasingly cause tension between the colonists and the ruled and the rulers, right? The colonists and Parliament. Um, Over 150 years, like we said, the people in America started to view themselves as separate. They had a different culture. They listened to different music. They made their own art. They spoke differently. Over 100 years, you know, they dropped their British accent, and they view themselves as different than the people living over in England. Well, add that to the unfairness that we're seeing here, the taxation, um, the Quartering Act. They're forced to feed and shelter British soldiers. The British soldiers who are clearly there just now to control the colonists. Um, it's tense. It's getting tense. So we're going to see that tension is going to bubble over, and blood will be shed. We're going to see next week the Boston Massacre, um, which wasn't a big, it wasn't 100 people. I think 5 people died. Okay, but uh, it was it was what it was, as we can see in this famous engraving, which appeared in the newspaper, right away. This is like right. Of course, they didn't have cameras back then, so somebody drew this engraving and then they put it in the newspaper. It was, as we can see, red coats, British soldiers shooting on a crowd of American colonists. Um, that's going to be a big deal. That's going to anger the Americans. Then we're gonna see the Boston Tea Party, the Tea Act, and the Boston Tea Party. They're gonna dump tea, British tea, which had been shipped over to Boston. They're gonna, instead of selling it, they're gonna dump it in Boston Harbor. And we're gonna see the Intolerable Acts, which is a bunch more acts of just plain punishment on the British colonists in America. Okay. So I think it's interesting, you can study the Revolutionary War, you can study the Civil War, but what I think is most important to learn from those periods, especially the Civil War. Yeah, it's fun to study the Civil War. Some people like the battles and the generals and going to Gettysburg and stuff like that. But the thing to take away from the Civil War in the 1860s and to some degree the Revolutionary War is what caused it, right? Because, yeah, you can always learn about a war, but if we're going to prevent our next war in American history, we need to understand what causes America to go to a war. What causes people, you and me, what causes us to get so angry that we would be willing to go to war? You know, the only way you can do that is to study past events. So the 1760s, 1770s, and as we march through these events towards that 1776 Declaration of Independence, I think that's pretty important to understand. You know. So what did we talk about today? We covered the Stamp Act and the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Act. So we didn't cover a lot. Next week we'll talk about the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party. Okay. Any questions on what we discussed today? Or any questions from yesterday? Any questions at all? Anything I can help with? Okay. Well, then I will email this out. You can read it. I would encourage you to read it over. You can even read what we're going to talk about next week. You can read ahead. That's probably a good idea. I'll email this out. I'll email the recording, and you guys can do what you want with it. You can watch it, not watch it, doesn't matter. But good luck studying this week. If you have any questions about anything, if I can help in any way, let me know. But your teacher, the other distance learning teachers are always great. If I can help somehow, just send me an email. So, if you don't have anything else, then thanks for logging in. You guys can have lunch a little early today.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Have a good day.
Yeah, you too, everybody. Have a good day.
And you too.